The Truth of Billy, the Kid and Billy Meier. By guest author April 28, 2023. Guest article by Robert Dawson.
Contrary to the nefarious mythology that has been falsely created around the Wild West icon popularly known as Billy the Kid, with whom Billy Meier has become associated, the contact notes provide a much different portrayal, but nonetheless is supported with historical evidence by which a careful re-examination confirms the accuracy of the information provided by Billy Meier and the Plejarians.
Excerpt from Contact Report 712, November 28, 2018.
But first I want to mention that Bernadette should be anxious to illustrate your name, Billy, which you received in Tehran in Persia through Judy Reed from Los Angeles, with a picture of Billy the Kid. That's because there was no stopping you, and you wanted to know what life story was really about Billy the Kid. Consequently, at your request, you were able to go back in time with my father to Billy the Kid, and meet him when my father told you that one day in the future you would be compared to him, and thus be given the name Billy, which would then become known worldwide as a result of your mission.
In principle, I have no objection to including the image of Billy the Kid in my biography, if it is explained that he was not the killer he was made out to be, because he was a completely different human being than he was falsely made out to be after his murder by the killer sheriff Patrick Floyd Jarvis Garrett, and by enemies and fans and know-it-alls, etc., and the whole thing is then made into a legend.
Above is a recently discovered rare photograph of Billy the Kid on the left, showing him in a much more domesticated light, wearing a stylish sweater and playing croquet with friends. In early October 2015, Kagan's Incorporated, a numismatic authentication firm, declared the image was authentic after a number of experts, including those associated with a recent National Geographic documentary, examined it. Kent Gibson, a forensic video and still image expert, provided the services of his facial recognition software and stated that William McCarty, Billy the Kid's real name, is indeed one of the individuals in the image. Whitney Braun, a professor and researcher, located an advertisement for croquet sets sold at Chapman's General Store in Las Vegas, New Mexico, dated to June 1878. It was later confirmed that the Kid's employer, cattle rancher John Turnstall, had purchased a croquet set and allowed his cowboy hands to use it. The discovery and authentication of the photograph is the subject of a documentary, Billy the Kid, New Evidence, co-produced by National Geographic and Kevin Costner, with narration provided by Kevin Costner.
Photograph of Billy the Kid taken 2 years prior to his meeting with Billy Meier. The photograph appears in Contact Report 712 and is provided by Pa.
I would also like to have a portrait of him when he was 15 years old, and you were able to meet him together with my father Svath in the past, which was taken 2 years earlier in the spring of 1877, but was not distributed.
Cover of the recently released biography of Billy Meier titled One Life ein Leben, authored in collaboration with Billy Edward Albert Meier, accredited authentic biography of Billy Edward Albert Meier, Billy Edward Albert Meier, Volume 1, 1937-1953. The photograph of Billy, which appears on the front cover, shows him as a kid of 8 years old. Photograph of Billy Meier taken when he was in Pakistan, where he had a reputation for bringing nefarious outlaws to justice and was given the nickname the Phantom. Another photograph of the Kid, which also appears in Billy Meier's autobiography as recommended by Ptah in CR 712. The original photograph today belongs to billionaire William McCoke, who bought it at an auction for $2.3 million. From CR 712.
He was also willing to work, industrious, honest, and thanked his employers for the kindness they showed him. In truth, he killed only one man, but he did not murder him, but shot him in the stomach in self-defense, thereby protecting his own life, as my father was able to clarify without any doubt. In this case, he was not only threatened, but compellingly faced with the choice of losing his life while still a young man, or fighting back to avoid being killed himself, because the adversary was jaded and calloused to stab a Billy the Kid. Thus, despite his young years, he was an educated young man, which was also evidenced by letters from him to Texas Governor Lew Wallace, with whom he was negotiating a pardon. The governor's secretary also said that Billy the Kid's writing was so expressive, educated, and eloquent, and also beautiful, that it was worth dreaming about.
Shown above is a letter from William H. Bonney, better known as Billy the Kid, to Lew Wallace, then the governor of the New Mexico Territory, displaying his eloquent handwriting, which Ptah alludes to. The letter confirms his intention to surrender to Wallace per a previous agreement he'd made with the governor for a pardon in exchange for his testimony, but expresses concern that he might be killed by his enemies after the arrest is made. Courtesy of Indiana Historical Society. Lew Wallace was an interesting historical character in his own right. He served as a brigadier general in the Union Army at the Battle of Shiloh during the American Civil War. A lawyer by training, he later served on the tribunal that tried the Lincoln assassination conspirators and presided over the one that convicted Henry Wirz, the commandant of the notorious prison camp at Andersonville, Gay, and the only Confederate executed for war crimes. But his most famous notoriety would come as a writer. While still living in the governor's mansion, Wallace completed his most famous novel, the story of a fictional hero, Judah Ben-Hur, whose life Wallace ingeniously intertwined with that of Emmanuel, spanning from the visit of the wise men from the Orient at his birth to his unjust crucifixion on the cross. It was titled Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ. Within 20 years of its publication, it had sold millions and became the best-selling book in America, second only to the Bible.
Lew Wallace on the cover of Harper's Weekly 1886, after Ben-Hur had become a bestseller. Courtesy of Indiana Historical Society. The cover of the first published edition of Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ, 1880. The novel would later be rewritten as a screenplay, and the 1959 film adaptation would win 11 Academy Awards, including Best Picture.
By 1900, Ben-Hur was the best-selling American novel of the 19th century, surpassing Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, and had been printed in 36 English-language editions and translated into 20 other languages, including Indonesian and Braille. The story's revenge plot, which cleverly transforms into a story of compassion and forgiveness, played an important role in the healing of a nation in the aftermath of the traumatic Civil War, during the Reconstruction years.
Excerpt from Talmud Emmanuel by Judas Iscariot, Chapter 5.
You have heard it falsely said through false prophets, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Truly, I say to you, however, exercise fairness according to the laws and recommendations of the creation, so that you find the verdict in insight rationality. Thus, you exercise neither hatred nor revenge nor retaliation. Page 118 of Authorized English Translation. Translation by Benjamin Stevens.
And according to Ptah in CR 712, these non-vengeful qualities were embodied by Billy the Kid.
In reality, he was neither malicious nor vengeful, and also did not kill 21 human beings, as was always claimed during his lifetime, and also after his murder, whereby this legend lie has survived until today.
Billy Meier had been instrumental in the rediscovering of the original text of Talmud Emmanuel. Lew Wallace was not a Christian himself, nor even religious by nature at the time that he wrote his famous novel, but claims he was inspired to write it after a several-hours-long conversation with Robert Ingersoll also a veteran of Shiloh, during an extended train ride. Robert Ingersoll was at that time the nation's most prominent atheist and a renowned orator who toured the country challenging religious orthodoxy and championing a healthy separation of church and state. Source: The Passion of Lew Wallace by John Swansburg. Capitalizing on the success of the novel, Ben-Hur was adapted into a screenplay and was performed live on stage to sold-out theaters throughout the country. To the left is a souvenir album with photographs of scenes from an early-stage adaptation of Lew Wallace's novel. A courtesy of Indiana Historical Society. After meeting with Billy the Kid in person, Lew Wallace would later admit to being charmed by him. Wallace once asked him for a demonstration of his marksmanship and was impressed by his handling of both six-shooter and rifle. Following Lew Wallace, another governor of the New Mexico Territory from 1897 to 1907, Miguel Antonio Otero, shown on the left, would write a book, but with nowhere near the success as Wallace. Published in 1936, The Real Billy the Kid recounts his childhood, encounters with the Apache, entanglement in the Lincoln County Cattle War, included interviews with a number of people in the vicinity of Lincoln County, and Fort Au. Sumner, who had been personally acquainted with the Kid. In Miguel's own words, his aim in the book was to write the Kid's story without embellishment, based entirely on actual fact. Otero knew the Kid briefly and also had known the man that killed Billy, Pat Garrett. He further knew that Pat Garrett's earlier biography of Billy the Kid was full of lies and fabrications, but had already reached a broad readership and shaped the popular perception for decades. Otero meticulously documented first-hand accounts, rather than relying on hearsay, and a few excerpts from the book appear below.
George L. Barber, surveyor and attorney. I was in Lincoln the day the Kid escaped from jail, and I realized then that he had the community completely on his side. Outside of a very few, the community was sympathetic toward the Kid, and the great majority was really glad that he made his escape. Hardly anyone believed he had received a fair trial, and they were glad to know that by his own ingenuity and nerve, he had succeeded in getting his neck out of the noose that was, it was supposed, soon to close around it tightly.
When Barber was asked his impression of just how the Kid looked, he said, "He was a mere boy in appearance, always gay, jovial, and high-spirited. But in an emergency, he always stood out as a leader, quick, resolute, and firm." George Barber would later marry the widow Susan McSween, the so-called cattle queen of New Mexico, who also knew Billy well and whose testimony appears later in this article. Deluvina's comments support those of Ta and CR 712.
Consequently, his Billy the Kid, death was also received with sadness and anger, precisely by those many people who knew him and his true nature and actions really well, and also knew that the Sheriff Pat Garrett was a vicious, cold-blooded, and money-hungry bounty hunter and passionate serial killer, that is to say, a killer. So it also turned out that he was notorious in this respect, and he was also treated like a leper by the righteous population. My father Sfath, in his annals, judged him to be a very helpful young man, who was also attracted to those fellows who were good to him, which he paid with sincere attachment and affection and sincere thanks.
Here, Susan's comments are also supportive of those of Ta in CR 712.
He valued sincere friendship highly. Consequently, he also always went out of his way for his friends and never left them unnoticed when they were in need of his help.
Susan McSween Barber. Billy was a graceful and beautiful dancer, and when in the company of a woman he was at all times extremely polite and respectful. Also, while in the presence of women he was neat and careful about his personal appearance. He was always a great favorite with women, and at a dance he was in constant demand. Yet with it all, he was entirely free from conceit or vanity. It was natural for him to be a perfect gentleman. I want to tell you a little story which will illustrate how much the natives loved him. One night, a party of soldiers from Fort Stanton, working in the interests of the Murphy gang, was on the trail for Billy for some offense committed on the Mescalero Reservation. A party of Mexicans from San Patricio was responsible for the trouble, but as usual it was charged to Billy, and the soldiers seemed determined to get him dead or alive. The trail followed by the soldiers led to a small adobe house occupied by a poor Mexican and his wife. As the adobe had but one room, the man and his wife were sleeping on a mattress in one corner of the room, while Billy was sleeping on another mattress in another corner. The soldiers first surrounded the house and then pounded on the door for admission. Billy instantly crept to the bed in which his friends slept and whispered to the woman and her husband, both of whom immediately got up. Billy quickly lay down on their bed, and the man and woman covered him with his own mattress and bedding. They then lay down on the top of the newly made bed. When the soldiers piled into the room demanding to know if Billy was there, both the man and the woman gruffly answered, "No!" The soldiers looked around the room with the aid of lighted matches, and failing to discover signs of any person other than the man and woman, they finally gave up, and mounting their horses, rode away. When they had gone, Billy reappeared from his place of concealment. This was just one of his many wonderful escapes. His plans were always formed and executed as swift as lightning, no matter what the emergency. He never seemed to hesitate or be at a loss, at least on only one occasion, and that was the time he and Pat Garrett met in the room at Pete Maxwell's. The story I have just told illustrates also how loyal and faithful the native people were to Billy. They would harbor him even if 100 warrants had been issued by the courts for his arrest. Billy was not a bad man. That is, he was not a murderer who killed wantonly. One thing is certain, Billy was as brave as they make them and knew how to defend himself. He was charged with practically all the killings in Lincoln County in those days, but that was simply because his name had become a synonym for daring and fearlessness. The truth is that Billy was quite alone in his class and stood out as sui generis. I could not help liking the boy.
On the morning of July 18, 1878, Susan McSween stood across the road from her home as the Lincoln County War approached its climax. For 4 days, the Dolan Murphy gang had her then-husband, Alex McSween, her sister Elizabeth Shield with her 5 children, Billy the Kid, and at least 9 other men calling themselves regulators, vowing to protect the McSweens, surrounded in their house. Not only that, the house was now on fire. Alex McSween decided to give himself up and walked out the front door unarmed. He was shot 5 times and killed where he stood. The regulators escaped in a dash out the back toward the riverbank and cover, while Billy the Kid, the last one left inside the burning house, and with the roof collapsing around him, came out the front door, bullets blasting from 6 guns in both hands, and he escaped. Source: Susan McSween Barber, Cattle Queen of New Mexico by John Knudsen. The events catapulted Susan McSween and a young cowboy named William McCarty, alias Billy Antrim, alias William H. Bonney, aliases the Kid, into the history books. Multiple versions of the story have been retold in newspaper and magazine articles during the day, pulp novels, and later television and movie adaptations. Unfortunately, Otero's book, The Real Billy the Kid, did not get published until the middle of the Great Depression and received little publicity or attention. Few people at that time even had the spare money to purchase a book. Despite Otero attesting to the factual representations of his sources and his personally transcribed interview with Billy the Kid, Pat Garrett and the other individuals who knew Billy the Kid Historians who have studied this period of the frontier have ignored Otero's documentation and primarily concentrated on the accepted narrative version for the life of the infamous outlaw, made popular in mass media, such as the article below in the New York Times. The New York Times, July 31st, 1881. This article, which is headed, "Billy the Kid's Life and Death," appeared less than 3 weeks after his death.
It begins. The killing of Billy the Kid has created a sensation in San Francisco. He was probably the most noted desperado on the Pacific coast. In appearance, Billy was one of the mildest persons imaginable. His soft blue eye was so attractive that those who saw him for the first time looked upon him as a victim of circumstances, with much, much more, including the events of his completely made-up mythological killing career presenting them as facts, such as, it was his boast that he had killed 1 man for every year of his life. He had not quite done that, but it is certain that he killed 19 men in the 21 years of his worse than worthless life. The article ends with, his killing is regarded by the citizens of California and Arizona as one of the most fortunate events which has occurred for years.
These narratives are two competing and conflicting histories of the same period and the same man. The narrative of Billy the Kid as a villain who has wronged society and therefore must be stopped for law and order to be restored, and more specifically, so that America can continue its manifest destiny to tame the Wild West, is an example of historical implotting. Implotting is a term coined by historian Hayden White in his work Metahistory, wherein he makes the case that history is a literary artifact, a verbal fiction that provides levels of information in order to employ offer meaning, by selecting which historical agents get to speak the voices of the past and thereby steers the consciousness. The selective implotting of American history began from its very inception and continues to the present day as explained by Billy in the Contact Notes from Contact Report 797.
All those, however, who have no knowledge or memory of what the history of America is really based on, are condemned to believe what they are lied to, and so they live with the lie and also die with it. America, as it still is today, will be defined by its history and dissolved in the following times.
The New York Times article was typical of the biased press which Billy received at the time, and only on rare occasion did a dissenting voice get heard in the media, but usually in forums with little circulation or readership such as the one below.
Duncan. Billy fled after killing the man in the barroom and started working in Lincoln County as a cowboy. Later on, he was defrauded by one of these men, who refused to keep his agreement of dividing at a certain time the profits of his business with the cowboys who aided him. The boys revolted and became part of the greater Lincoln County cattle war.
From CR 712.
He also saved settler families from Indians, joined gangs without ever killing any other human beings, also stole cattle because he was not paid his due wages for the work he had done and was therefore innocently sentenced to death.
When Duncan was asked by the reporter why he didn't notify authorities and collect the bounty on Billy, he replied that he would rather have cut off his right hand than betray him, even could he have done so. In the case of Billy the Kid, the blurring of the truth was further magnified by fictitious plays with made-up storylines and performed all across the nation. Numerous plays, more than 800 literary, cinematic, and historical representations presenting a different history and a different life, all contributed to the creation of an American legend and myth. The mythology of Billy the Kid had become commercialized and sold as an entertainment commodity, much like Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. Above is an advertising poster with scenes from the play Billy the Kid, The Everlasting Success. With a company of metropolitan artists, date 1907 Billy the Kid was a successful play for 12 consecutive years. After an opening run in the New York Start Theater in New York, beginning August 13, 1906, it enjoyed long runs at leading theaters throughout the county. It was claimed in 1913 that the play had already been witnessed by over 6 million people. From CR 712.
Finally, it is important to note that Billy the Kid was a young man who was often abused and argued with by his stepfather, which led him to learn to play cards in saloons at an early age, where he also had to defend himself against a blacksmith who tried to stab him.
According to eyewitnesses, the blacksmith that Ptah alludes to began the brawl after losing to the Kid in a game of cards and refusing to pay up. The Real Billy the Kid by Miguel Antonio Otero. The black and white image above from 1877 shows Billy the Kid playing cards with 3 friends, Richard Brewer, Fred Waite, and Henry Brown. The photograph was given by Billy the Kid to a friend, Billy Wilson, for safekeeping prior to his death, and it had been safely kept within the Wilson family for decades. The picture's authenticity has been verified by the George Eastman Museum in Texas, which is the world's oldest museum dedicated to photography and named after the founder of Kodak. The picture above is from the news article linked below. In 2010, New Mexico Governor Bill Richardson denied a formal petition to grant a posthumous pardon to Billy the Kid, the very pardon that had originally been promised to him by Governor Lew Wallace, but was never carried out by the state attorney general. From CR 712.
However, I would now like to suggest to Bernadette that she include in your biography the circumstances of how your surname Billy came about.
The excerpt below is from Ein Leben, the recently released biography of Billy Meier by Bernadette Brand. Billy Edward Albert Meier.
In the past 20 years or so, the name Billy Edward Albert Meier for Billy Edward Albert Meier has become more and more commonly used. This not only in connection with ufology, but also with the teaching of the creation energy spiritual teaching, and above all in the English-speaking world, for which the full name of Billy Edward Albert Meier is somewhat unpatent and difficult to pronounce. The German form of the full name is rather a tongue-twister in English, which is why it is Englishized, and then gets a completely wrong and very disharmonious sound. Probably mainly for this reason, the English-speaking world also gives preference to the name Billy Edward Albert Meier. And besides, this name, translated into the German language, means Ray, which is extremely appropriate in any case, because not only the person who is connected with, but also the teaching of truth, teaching of the energy of creation, teaching of life work like a ray of brightest and glistening light in our furiously fast, ever darker time. Also, the life of Billy Edward Albert Meier as such shows what the connection to the creative natural laws and the faithful implementation of the creative natural laws and commandments in one's own life make everything possible, and what immense vitality results from it.
In this respect, we actually have knowledge, because in our annals I found some time ago from the records of Henoch all these names and designations in relation to your person. Henoch. It was during his work on Earth at that time, when about 13,500 years ago he, through foresight, extended the Nocademian prophet lineage up to the 3rd millennium, recorded all these names and designations, whereby, however, still another one more name is given, which will be named for you and will become world famous. This name will be composed from the first letters of all your names, thus from Billy Edward Albert Meier. Consequently, the new pseudonym Billy Edward Albert Meier will result. This is the English word for beam, and like such a beam, the mission will spread over the world and carry the teaching into the farthest future. So it is written in the annals of Henoch, and so it will be.
Article by Robert Dawson.